Hey, this is Ben from FastingWell, and today I'll be talking about some foods that make sense to eat before you start fasting. And we'll break it down a few different ways. I'm going to share a few principles and then give you some specific examples as well. But when people ask this question, usually they're probably thinking of longer fasts of 24 hours or 36 hours or multiple days of fasting, which we sometimes call extended fasting. So what should you eat before you start extended fasting? Well, there are a couple principles to consider. So one of those is carb dependence. So most of us are very dependent on carbs all the time. So as soon as we take away the carbs, we get withdrawals. And sometimes that's called keto flu. So if you go on a very low carb diet, which is a keto diet, then you might get this keto flu because you're kind of having withdrawals from all the sugar and the grains and things that your brain's used to running on. So if you're going to do some extended fasting, ideally try to go through those carb withdrawals before you ever start. So doing fewer processed foods or doing a low carb diet are a couple logical ways to do that. And it gives you some time to let your mind and your body adapt. So that's principle number one, is kind of going through those carb withdrawals beforehand. The second thing is, once you start an extended fast, your main energy source, for your brain at least, is going to be ketones. Ketones are that alternative energy source for your brain that your body can make out of body fat or dietary fat. So you make ketones out of fat, and that's the main energy source for your brain. So you want to ideally get your ketones up in advance before you start a long fast, and it's just going to smooth that transition out quite a bit. So how do you do that? Well, there are basically two ways. You can either eat a ketogenic diet, get into nutritional ketosis, as we would sometimes call that, and that will help raise your ketones. If you do that for several days before you start your extended fast, you'll get your ketones up and you'll be ready to go. Another option, another kind of newer way you can do this, is there are ketone supplements that you can use, or also known as exogenous ketones. So a shortcut you could use is to start drinking some ketone supplements on the first day of your fast and the second day of your fast and maybe the third day of your fast. If you're doing a multi-day fast, it depends on how long your fast is, obviously. But throughout your extended fast, especially the first few days, you could drink these ketone supplements and to help get your ketones up at the very beginning. Because once you start fasting, it usually takes about 2 to 3 days for your ketones to naturally rise to very high levels. So those first 2 or 3 days, that's what you're targeting, either by doing a ketogenic diet in advance or by drinking those ketone supplements. So hopefully that made sense so far. So those are a few principles to consider. Now let's talk about a few specific examples of things you could eat before you start fasting. Again, if you're doing just short-term daily intermittent fasting, that sort of thing, then just try to cut back on the processed foods and stick to unprocessed foods, whole foods as much as possible, and that's going to make that easier for you. The same thing's true for extended fasting, but that's just the first step, is cut out the processed foods. But if you're doing that longer fast, here are some specific things you could eat. So one way to think about it is there's a specific protocol that Dr. Jason Fung and Megan Ramos have used in their clinic and that they've talked about publicly a few times, and that is 4 foods for 4 days. So for 4 days leading up to your extended fast, you're going to stick with just these 4 foods. And those are the only things you're allowed to eat on those 4 days. Eat as much as you want, but only those 4 foods and minimal seasoning, just some salt basically. So those 4 foods are eggs, bacon, avocados, and olives. So those are the 4 foods that they use. So you're allowed to eat as much as you want of those foods, but nothing else for those 4 days, and then you start your fast. So what that does is it helps you go through some of the carb withdrawals, because those are pretty low in carbs, and it actually starts to boost your ketones as well, because those foods are high in fat. So low carb, high fat, that's what you want, right? So that's a protocol that you could use. If you want a few other ideas about things to eat before you start your extended fast, basically it's anything else that's low in carbs and high in fat. So here are a couple other specific examples. You could use something like coconut oil or MCT oil. I'll lump those together because they're kind of similar to each other. So you could just get some extra pure fat. And one way to do that is you kind of melt it in your coffee and then just drink it with your coffee or your tea or another hot drink. So getting some extra fat like coconut oil, MCT oil, or butter will help boost your ketone levels and help you kind of transition into fat burning mode a little more quickly. Another option you could use would be some nuts. There are various kinds. Let's just say almonds for the sake of argument. So you could have some almonds on those days leading up to your fast. And because that's another thing that's pretty low in carbs, pretty high in fat, and the carbs that it does have are pretty slowly digested, so it's not really going to spike your blood sugar or spike your insulin or anything like that. So another option that you could do would be to eat something like meat or fish or poultry. So I'll just kind of lump those together because they're fairly similar in a lot of ways. So these are animal foods, of course, that are low in carbs, have basically zero carbs, and some of them are high in fat. Depending on which one you choose, it can be high in fat. So that's exactly what you want. And that also kind of helps you, say, imagine having a big juicy steak with an avocado, and some eggs. So that's an example of something you might eat if you were trying to feast before you fast, because in general there should be a balance between feasting and fasting. In other words, if you're fasting to improve your health or to lose weight, you don't want to diet or cut your calories on the days when you're eating. You need kind of that balance. You need to tell your body, hey, there's plenty of food available, but sometimes we're not going to eat all of it. So in other words, your body gets the message. We don't need to go into starvation mode because we're feasting on those other days, but then we're going to fast. So just having that big steak or something like that, or like a big piece of salmon, fish, or whatever, is one of those ways where you could feast before you fast. And so that's another thing that kind of makes sense to do before an extended fast. All right, so those were some key principles to consider, as well as some specific options that you could use to eat before you start a short-term fast or a long-term fast. I'm going to link to a few resources in the video description below, and that includes a complete beginner's guide to the ketogenic diet, a list of a whole bunch of low-carb, high-fat foods that you could use for this situation to be on a ketogenic diet or just to get ready for fasting. I'm also going to link to a blog post about eating whole foods, unprocessed foods, and kind of how to think about that and how to do that. And then lastly, I'll include a link to a specific ketone supplement that I've been using that seems to be a good quality supplement and that you could also use if you want. It's called Keto Start, so I'll put a link to that as well. So hopefully that information was helpful. And by the way, I'm a physician assistant, which is similar to a doctor. I've been working in the emergency room for several years, and I also have some experience in family practice and urgent care. And for the last several years, I've been spending a lot of time learning about nutrition and fasting and doing a lot of self-experimentation as well, and trying to help other people improve their health, take control of their health, basically, so they can prevent complications of diabetes and other types of health problems. So I've got a podcast which walks you through this kind of stuff step by step, and I'll put a link to that in the video description. And I've also got a blog, as I mentioned earlier, and of course this YouTube channel. So anyway, hope the information helps, and I'll see you next time on the FastingWell YouTube channel.